She was left to die in a dark alley at just 15. But the vampire king whispered, "You're safe with me." Watch as a fragile human girl transforms her fate, faces ancient secrets, and rises beside the most feared being in the world. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more thrilling supernatural romance stories. Asterisk on a freezing night, a beaten 15-year-old girl is thrown away like she means nothing. But someone powerful is already watching from the shadows. The wind howled through the narrow streets as the city sank into darkness, carrying with it the quiet cruelty people tried to ignore. In a forgotten alley behind the grand buildings, a fragile girl lay motionless on the cold ground, her small body trembling from pain and exhaustion. She was only 15, yet life had already stripped her of everything: family, safety, and even hope. Blood stained her torn clothes, and each shallow breath felt like a battle she was slowly losing. Moments earlier, the people who were supposed to protect her had abandoned her there, treating her like she was nothing more than a burden they no longer wanted to carry. Their footsteps had faded, leaving behind silence and the faint echo of her suffering. Her name was Elara, though no one had spoken it with kindness in a long time. Since losing her parents, she had lived under the control of relatives who saw her not as family, but as a tool. She worked endlessly, endured harsh words, and learned to stay quiet no matter how much it hurt. Tonight, however, something had changed. The anger of those around her had turned into something darker, something more violent, and she had been beaten until she could no longer stand. When she collapsed, they decided she was no longer worth keeping. So they dragged her into the alley and left her there, certain she would not survive the night. Elara's vision blurred as tears mixed with the cold air. She tried to move, but her body refused to respond. The world around her felt distant, like she was already slipping away. Still, deep inside her, a small spark refused to die. She did not want to give up. She wanted to live, even if she didn't know why anymore. With the last of her strength, her lips parted, and a faint whisper escaped into the darkness, barely louder than the wind itself. "Please, someone—" The alley remained silent for a moment, as if the world had chosen to ignore her one last time. But then something shifted. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the night itself had taken a breath. A presence moved at the far end of the alley, unseen yet undeniable. Footsteps followed, slow, steady, and impossibly calm. Whoever was approaching did not rush, did not hesitate. They moved with quiet authority, like the darkness belonged to them. From the shadows emerged a tall figure, his form sharp against the dim light of the distant street. His coat flowed with the wind, and his eyes, pale and piercing, reflected something ancient and unreadable. This was no ordinary man. This was a being feared by all who knew the truth hidden beneath the city's surface, the vampire king. He stopped when he saw her, his gaze falling upon her fragile form. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. He was known for his cold nature, for his lack of mercy toward humans. Yet something about this broken girl caught his attention in a way he could not immediately understand. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, yet strangely calm. Elara barely managed to open her eyes as his shadow fell over her. Fear should have taken over, but she was too weak to feel it. All she saw was a figure standing between her and the darkness that threatened to consume her completely. Slowly, he knelt beside her, his expression unreadable as he studied her injuries, the marks of cruelty left behind by others. For a long second, he said nothing. Then, in a voice deep and steady, carrying a strange warmth despite its power, he spoke words no one had ever said to her before. "You're safe with me." And in that moment, as the cold night wrapped around them, the girl who had been left to die felt something she had not felt in years' safety. Asterisk, the ruthless vampire. king who never spared a human life carries a broken girl into his palace, shocking an entire kingdom that fears his every decision. The night did not grow warmer, yet everything changed the moment the vampire king lifted Elara from the cold ground. Her fragile body felt weightless in his arms, as if the world itself had already begun to let her go. But he did not. Without hesitation, he turned away from the alley, his expression calm yet unreadable, and walked toward the towering palace that ruled the city from the shadows. The guards at the gates straightened the moment they saw him, their fear evident even in their silence. But that fear quickly turned into confusion when they noticed the unconscious human girl in his arms. No one dared to question him, yet every pair of eyes followed him as he entered, carrying something no one had ever seen him protect before. Inside the palace, the air was heavy with quiet tension. The walls, carved with ancient symbols, had witnessed centuries of power and cruelty, but never an act like this. Servants froze in place, lowering their heads as the king passed, unsure whether to be afraid or curious. Humans were not allowed within these walls unless they served a purpose, and even then, they were never treated with care. Yet here he was, holding one as if her life held value. The whispers began immediately, though none were spoken aloud in his presence. He moved through the grand halls without slowing, his focus entirely on the girl in his arms. Her breathing was weak, uneven, and every moment mattered. When he reached his private chambers, he placed her gently on a bed far too grand for someone like her, his movements controlled, almost careful. For a brief moment, he simply stood there, observing her face. Beneath the bruises and blood, there was something fragile, something untouched by the cruelty she had endured. It stirred something unfamiliar within him, something he had long buried. A sharp knock broke the silence. Without waiting for permission, the royal physician entered, summoned by unseen command. His eyes widened the moment he saw the girl. "My king, a human?" he asked carefully, his voice filled with disbelief. The vampire king did not respond immediately. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on Elara as he spoke in a calm, firm tone. "Treat her, now." There was no room for argument, no space for doubt. The physician bowed his head and moved quickly, examining her injuries with practiced precision. As the physician worked, word spread through the palace like wildfire. The nobles, the guards, the ancient vampires who had served the throne for centuries, all of them began to question what this meant. The king was known for his discipline, his distance from human affairs, and his refusal to show weakness. Bringing a human girl into his chambers was not just unusual. It was unthinkable. Some believed it was a passing curiosity. Others feared it was something far more dangerous. Meanwhile, Elara remained unaware of the storm her presence had created. She lay still, caught between pain and darkness, her mind drifting in and out of consciousness. Yet even in that state, she felt something different. The fear that had followed her for years was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of calm she could not explain. It was as if the very air around her had changed, shielding her from the world that had tried to destroy her. The vampire king stood beside her, unmoving, his presence steady like an unbreakable wall. He did not speak, did not reveal the thoughts hidden behind his cold exterior. But deep within, a question had begun to form, one he could not ignore. Out of all the humans in the world, why had this one mattered? And for the first time in centuries, the king who feared nothing found himself waiting. Not for power, not for war, but for a fragile human girl to open her eyes. As the broken girl begins to heal inside the vampire king's palace, she whispers words no human should know, awakening. A secret that could change everything. Morning never truly arrived inside the palace. Yet a soft gray light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the grand chamber where Elara lay. Her breathing had grown steadier through the night, though her body still bore the marks of cruelty she had endured. The royal physician had done his work well, carefully treating every wound, but even he could not fully explain how she was recovering so quickly. It was as if something within her refused to give in to the damage. The vampire king had not left her side. He stood near the window, silent and still, his presence as commanding as ever. Yet his attention never strayed far from the girl resting behind him. Hours passed in quiet tension until a faint movement broke the stillness. Elara stirred, her fingers twitching slightly against the soft fabric beneath her. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, as if she was unsure whether she was still trapped in a nightmare. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, far too elegant for anything she had ever known, and the air felt different, cool, yet strangely comforting. Panic flickered in her chest, but it faded when her gaze shifted and found him standing there. The memory of the alley returned in fragments, along with the deep voice that had cut through the darkness. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The vampire king watched her carefully, observing every small reaction, every hint of fear or confusion. He expected her to recoil, to tremble at the sight of him, as most humans did when they realized what he truly was. But Elara did not scream or try to run. She simply looked at him, her expression weak but calm, as if she no longer had the strength to be afraid. "You're awake," he said finally, his voice low and steady. Elara tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her body still too weak. She managed only a small nod before her eyes began to close again. As she drifted between consciousness and sleep, something unexpected happened. Her lips moved once more, but this time the words that escaped were not broken or desperate. They were ancient, a soft, unfamiliar language flowed from her, quiet but clear, carrying a rhythm that did not belong to the human world. The moment the words reached his ears, the vampire king froze. His expression, usually so controlled, shifted with a rare flicker of shock. He understood every word she spoke, yet that was impossible. The language she murmured had been lost for centuries, known only to the oldest of his kind. A language tied to the origins of vampire bloodlines and forbidden histories. He stepped closer, his gaze sharpening as he listened. Elara's voice remained faint, her body still weak, but the words continued as if they were drawn from a place deep within her. She was not aware of what she was saying, her mind caught in dreams she could not control. Yet the meaning behind her words was clear enough to unsettle even him. She was calling for protection, not in the simple way a frightened child might, but in a tone that carried something deeper, something ancient and binding. It was not a plea, it was a call that echoed with power, as if it had been spoken many times before, across forgotten ages. The room fell silent again as her voice faded, her body relaxing back into stillness. But the air had changed. The calm that once filled the space was now replaced with something heavier, something filled with questions that could not be ignored, that the vampire king stood beside her, his mind no longer at ease. This was no ordinary human girl. There was something hidden within her, something that should not exist in the modern world. And for the first time, since he had brought her into his palace, he realized that saving her might not have been a simple act of mercy, that it might have been the beginning of something far greater and far more dangerous. Asterisk, the palace that saved her now turns against her, and the fragile girl must face humiliation again. But this time, she refuses to break. The days that followed Elara's awakening were quiet on the surface. Yet beneath that silence, tension spread through the vampire king's palace like a hidden storm. News of the human girl had reached every corner of the royal court, and curiosity quickly turned into suspicion. The ancient vampires who served the throne were not known for their kindness, especially toward humans, whom they considered weak and disposable. To them, Elara's presence was an insult to tradition, a disruption of order, and most of all, a mystery they did not trust. Despite the king's authority, whispers of doubt and disapproval grew louder with each passing hour. Elara, still recovering, remained unaware of the full extent of their resentment. But she could feel it in the way the servants avoided her gaze and in the cold looks she received when she was guided through the halls. Though she had been given a room and proper care, she did not feel like a guest. She felt like an outsider standing in a place that did not want her. The comfort she had felt on the first night slowly faded, replaced by a familiar sense of unease. She thought she had escaped. Yet this time, she did not lower her head as she once would have. Something inside her had begun to change. One evening, she was summoned to the Grand Hall, a place reserved for gatherings of the royal court. The room was vast and filled with towering figures, each one radiating power and authority far beyond anything she had ever known. Their eyes followed her as she entered, sharp and judging, as if they were searching for a reason to reject her existence. At the center of the hall stood the Vampire King, his presence calm but commanding, watching everything without speaking. A noble stepped forward, his expression cold and unimpressed. "So this is the human who has captured our king's attention," he said, his voice echoing through the hall. There was no respect in his tone, only quiet mockery. "She looks ordinary." Soft laughter followed, spreading among the court like a ripple of cruelty. Elara felt the weight of their judgment press down on her, but she did not look away. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, yet she forced herself to stand still. She had spent years being treated as if she was nothing, but something about this moment felt different. She was no longer alone in an alley, waiting to be discarded. She was standing in front of those who expected her to break, and for the first time, she chose not to. The noble's gaze hardened as he circled her slowly, examining her as though she were an object. "Tell us, girl," he continued, "why should you be allowed to remain here? What value do you bring to this palace?" His words were sharp, meant to provoke fear, to remind her of her place. Before she could respond, a sudden disturbance broke the tension. A guard rushed into the hall, his expression urgent. "My king," he said, bowing quickly, "there has been an attack at the eastern gate." The room shifted instantly, the nobles turning their attention to the news. Danger was not uncommon, but the urgency in the guard's voice was enough to unsettle even them. Without hesitation, the Vampire King moved, his authority taking control of the situation. But before he could give orders, another voice echoed from the entrance, a warning too late to ignore. A figure burst into the hall, injured and struggling to remain standing. Chaos followed, and in the midst of it, a threat emerged, faster and closer than anyone expected. Elara saw it before the others reacted. Instinct, not thought, drove her forward. Despite her weakness, despite the fear still lingering in her body, she stepped into danger without hesitation. Her movement was small, almost fragile, yet it was enough to disrupt what could have been a deadly strike aimed at someone far more powerful than her. The room fell silent for a split second as the moment passed, and in that silence, everything changed. For the first time, the court no longer saw her as just a helpless human. And for the first time, the Vampire King saw something in her that went far beyond survival. He saw courage. The truth behind the girl's past is finally revealed, and the same people who left her to die were terrified of what she was destined to become. The silence that followed Elara's act of courage did not last long, but its impact lingered in every corner of the Grand Hall. The nobles who had mocked her moments ago now watched her with a different kind of attention, one that carried both unease and curiosity. The injured guard was quickly taken away, and the immediate threat was contained. Yet the tension remained thick in the air. The Vampire King stood still, his sharp gaze fixed on Elara, replaying the moment she had stepped forward without hesitation. It had not been strength that drove her, nor power, but something far rarer pure instinct to protect. And that alone was enough to change everything. As the court slowly regained its composure, one of the eldest nobles stepped forward, his presence heavier than the others. His expression no longer filled with mockery, but with deep concern. "My king," he began, his voice low and controlled, "this is no ordinary human. There is something within her that we cannot ignore." His words shifted the attention of the entire hall back to Elara, who now stood quietly, her energy nearly drained from what she had just done. The vampire king did not respond immediately. Instead, he gestured for the hall to be cleared. One by one, the nobles stepped back, though their eyes lingered, filled with questions they did not dare to ask openly. When the doors finally closed, only a few remained: the king, the elder noble, and Elara herself. The atmosphere grew heavier, more serious, as if the truth waiting to be revealed carried a weight none of them could avoid. The elder noble stepped closer, studying Elara carefully. "Child," he said, his tone softer now, "do you remember anything from your past? Anything unusual?" Elara hesitated, her mind searching through memories she had long tried to forget. Her life had been filled with pain and survival, leaving little room for anything else. But as she focused, fragments began to surface, small, unclear moments that had never made sense to her before. There were dreams, she said quietly, her voice uncertain. Strange ones. Voices speaking words I didn't understand. And sometimes I felt like someone was watching me, protecting me. She lowered her gaze, unsure if what she was saying mattered. The elder noble exchanged a glance with the vampire king, his expression tightening. "It is as I feared," he murmured. "She carries the mark of an ancient bloodline." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elara looked up, confusion filling her eyes. She did not understand what he meant, but the seriousness in his voice made her heart race. The vampire king finally spoke, his tone calm but firm. "Explain." There was no hesitation in his command. The elder noble took a slow breath before continuing. "Long before this kingdom was established, there existed a rare connection between humans and our kind. A bloodline that carried both vulnerability and power. It was said that those born with it could awaken abilities tied to our origins, abilities that could either protect or destroy." He paused, his gaze returning to Elara. "Most feared it. Many tried to erase it completely." Elara felt a chill run through her. "You mean people tried to kill me because of this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The answer came not from the elder, but from the vampire king himself. "Yes," he said simply. The truth struck her harder than any blow she had ever endured. The people who had hurt her, abandoned her, and left her to die had not acted out of simple cruelty. They had been afraid of something she did not even know she possessed. For a moment, anger and sadness mixed within her, but instead of breaking her, it strengthened something deep inside. The vampire king stepped closer, his presence steady and unshaken. "You were not meant to die in that alley," he said, his voice carrying quiet certainty. "And you will not be harmed again." Elara looked at him, her fear slowly giving way to something else, trust. For the first time, her past no longer felt like a chain holding her back. It felt like the beginning of something she had yet to understand. And in that moment, both of them realized the same truth. Her story was not one of survival anymore. It was the beginning of destiny. The girl who was once left to die now stands before the world's most powerful beings, and this time, she is no longer the victim. The grand hall was filled once again. But this time the atmosphere was different. The same nobles who had once doubted Elara now stood in silence, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of respect and uncertainty. Word of her true lineage had spread quickly, and the weight of that truth had changed everything. No longer seen as a helpless human, she was now something far more significant, someone connected to an ancient power that even the oldest vampires could not ignore. Yet despite this, Elara stood just as she always had, simple and calm, her strength not coming from power, but from the quiet resilience she had carried through every moment of her life. At the center of the hall, the Vampire King remained seated on his throne, his presence steady and commanding. His gaze never left Elara as she stepped forward, her movements slow but confident. The journey from the cold alley to this moment had not been easy, but it had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She was no longer the broken girl waiting to be saved. She had become someone who could stand on her own, even in a world that once sought to destroy her. A voice broke the silence, sharp and filled with lingering doubt. One of the nobles stepped forward, unwilling to fully accept what had been revealed. "Power alone does not make her worthy," he said firmly. "She is still human, weak, untrained. How can we trust that she will not become a danger to us all?" His words echoed through the hall, stirring the uncertainty that still remained among some of the court. Elara heard every word, but she did not flinch. Instead, she took another step forward, her eyes meeting his without fear. "You're right," she said softly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I am human. I was weak. I was afraid." She paused, letting her words settle. "But I chose to stand when I could have fallen. I chose to protect when I could have run. That is not weakness." Her voice grew stronger with each word, not loud, but filled with quiet conviction. The hall fell silent again, but this time it was not filled with doubt. It was filled with thought. The Vampire King rose from his throne, his movement commanding immediate attention. He stepped down slowly, his presence alone enough to silence any remaining whispers. When he reached Elara, he did not stand above her as a ruler over a subject. He stood beside her, equal in the eyes of everyone watching. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of centuries. "She has already proven her worth," he said. "Not through power, but through courage. Not through fear, but through compassion." His gaze swept across the hall, challenging anyone to oppose him. "This kingdom has long believed that strength comes from dominance alone. That belief ends today." The noble who had spoken earlier lowered his head, unable to argue further. One by one, the others followed, their resistance fading under the weight of both truth and authority. What they had once seen as weakness, they now began to understand as something far more valuable. Elara stood still, her heart steady, as the moment unfolded around her. For the first time, she was not being judged for what she lacked, but recognized for what she had become. The pain of her past had not defined her. It had shaped her into someone stronger, someone capable of changing the very world that had once rejected her. The Vampire King turned to her, his expression softer than it had ever been. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic promises. Instead, his actions spoke clearly as he extended his hand to her, not as a command, but as an offer. Elara looked at him for a brief moment before placing her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of everything they had been through. Trust, respect, and something deeper that neither of them needed to put into words. And as they stood together, the message became clear to all who watched. Respect is not given to power alone. It is earned through kindness, courage, and the strength to rise when the world tries to break you.